white cop mocked a black teen. Seconds later, he regretted it. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the sidewalk as the teenager walked home. His headphones rested comfortably over his ears, the rhythm of his favorite song carrying him forward at a steady pace. A backpack hung from one shoulder, its weight shifting with each step, filled with notebooks and the leftover sandwich from lunch. His face was calm, eyes fixed ahead, mind elsewhere, focused on nothing more urgent than the thought of dinner waiting for him at home. The neighborhood was familiar, lined with quiet houses and the hum of cicadas in the distance. The sudden flash of red and blue lights cut into the serenity like a blade. Tires ground against the pavement as a police cruiser pulled up alongside him. The sound pulled him from the music, his hand instinctively lowering the volume before slipping the headphones from his ears. The vehicle idled just a little too close, its shadow stretching across his sneakers. The door opened with a sharp click, and out stepped a white police officer, his presence filling the space with authority not requested and not needed. His eyes scanned the boy up and down as if he had already found something wrong. The officer's hand rested on his belt, not aggressively but suggestively, the gesture loaded with suspicion. "What are you doing out here?" the officer asked, his tone flat but edged. The question hung in the air as though the act of walking home was crime enough. The teenager blinked, surprised, pulling one headphone completely off. "Just heading home from school," he said quietly, his voice steady but tinged with the uncertainty that always came when authority loomed without reason. The officer's eyes narrowed. He circled slightly, forcing the boy to adjust his stance on the sidewalk. The neighborhood, moments earlier filled with the ordinary hum of life, now felt like a stage. A woman watering her garden across the street paused, her hose dangling as she glanced at the unfolding scene. A jogger slowed, eyes flicking nervously before deciding to keep moving. The teenager shifted his backpack higher on his shoulder. He knew better than to let impatience or fear show. He kept his tone polite, his posture still. He had been taught from a young age how quickly things could turn if a single gesture was misread. Yet the officer pressed, his words sharp, his suspicion unfounded. "You live around here?" he demanded, the edge of disbelief riding each syllable. His hand remained at his belt, his posture stiff with assumption. "Yes, sir," the boy replied, nodding toward the street ahead. "My house is just down there." But the officer did not look. His gaze lingered on the boy's shoes, his clothes, his backpack, as if they told a story he had already written in his mind. The quiet of the street grew heavy, the sound of the cruiser's idling engine filling the air. The boy's heart beat faster, but his face stayed calm. He knew this was not about what he had done, but about who he was. He stood quietly, waiting, headphones dangling at his side, wondering why his walk home had become a stop that held the entire block's attention. The officer's smirk widened as if the flashing lights behind him were a stage meant only for his performance. He looked the teenager up and down, his gaze dripping with disdain, before letting out a laugh that carried across the street. "What are you wearing?" he said loudly, gesturing at the boy's hoodie and scuffed sneakers. "You look like you just crawled out of a bargain bin." His voice was sharp, designed to carry, and it did. Curtains moved, doors cracked open, and more eyes fixed on the scene. The boy stood still, headphones dangling from his hand, his backpack heavy on his shoulder. He did not answer. His silence only seemed to fuel the officer's need to belittle. "How old are you, 15? 16? The man continued, circling slightly as though inspecting something beneath him. "Let me tell you something, kid. Kids like you don't end up anywhere. You'll never amount to anything." The words hung in the air like a curse, thick and cruel, settling into the ears of everyone close enough to hear. People on the sidewalk stopped, shifting uneasily. A woman carrying groceries paused, her eyes narrowing as she slowed her pace. A jogger, sweat dripping down his forehead, pulled out an earbud and frowned. The neighbor watering his lawn across the street froze, the hose dangling forgotten in his hand. Their faces carried the same discomfort, the same unwillingness to step forward, yet none of them spoke. The silence of the bystanders wrapped around the cruelty like a shroud, amplifying its sting. The officer's voice grew louder, mocking not only the boy's clothes but his very presence. "What are you even doing here? You think this neighborhood is for you? People like you end up in trouble. Not in schools, not in jobs. Just trouble." His words were venom-dressed in authority, sharp and deliberate, a show of power meant to humiliate. The boy's eyes flickered briefly toward the crowd, catching the glances of those who watched, some with pity, some with unease, none with courage enough to intervene. He drew a slow breath, steadying himself, his posture still calm. His dignity was intact, even under the weight of the insult. The silence he carried was louder than the officer's sneer, though the man in uniform did not notice. Instead, the officer stepped closer, leaning in as though he could pierce the boy's resolve with words alone. "One day you'll remember this moment," he spat, "because it'll be the first of many times someone tells you the truth. You're nothing." The arrogance in his voice filled the block, pressing against every ear that heard it. And yet, even as humiliation hung heavy in the air, the boy did not break. His calm presence became a quiet act of defiance, one that the officer mistook for weakness. The bystanders shifted again, the discomfort spreading, whispers rising softly among them. The cruelty was undeniable, and though the officer thought he was in control, everyone watching could sense that his words, so full of mockery, carried the weight of a mistake that would not be forgotten. The officer's voice rose with each passing second, feeding on the silence of the boy as though it were a challenge. He demanded answers with questions designed not to seek truth but to corner, his tone dripping with mock authority. "Why are you walking here? Where are you really going? Who are you meeting?" His words were sharp and repetitive, each one delivered with a smirk, as though he could force embarrassment to bloom in the teenager's eyes. The boy stood his ground, headphones still dangling at his side, backpack strap pulled tighter across his shoulder. His lips remained pressed, his gaze steady but respectful. He did not feed the mockery with anger, nor did he lower his head in submission. He understood what the officer wanted, an outburst, a crack, a flinch, but he gave him nothing. His silence carried more weight than words could have, and it unsettled the onlookers who continued to gather along the edges of the street. The officer's smirk stretched wider, a cruel show for the crowd. He raised his voice loud enough to draw attention from houses down the block, his words carrying with the sharpness of accusation. "Look at this kid," he barked, gesturing with an open hand as though presenting evidence. "Too proud to answer, too proud to admit what he's up to. This is what trouble looks like." Whispers rippled through the bystanders, some shaking their heads, others averting their eyes. A few pulled out phones, the glow of recording screens catching the light as they captured each insult, each mocking word. The air was thick with discomfort, but the officer continued, reveling in his performance. He stepped closer, his boots heavy on the pavement, his shadow stretching over the boy. "Cat, got your tongue? Or are you just too scared to speak? You think you're smart, don't you? You think you're better than me?" His laugh echoed, hollow and forced, but loud enough to silence the neighborhood. Still, the boy did not break. His chest rose and fell with slow, measured breaths. His eyes remained fixed, his composure unshaken. The dignity in his silence was louder than the officer's cruelty. Where the man's arrogance sought to make him small, his calm presence made him tall. The crowd felt it too, even if they could not put it into words. Something in the balance of the moment was shifting, though the officer remained blind to it. The officer leaned in, lowering his voice, just enough for those closest to hear. "One day, you'll look back and realize I was right about you. Nothing. That's what you'll be." He straightened, his laughter erupting again, desperate to cover the weakness beneath his anger. But as the boy stood steady, his silence intact, the arrogance began to look more like desperation, and the smirk began to look more like fear. The officer's voice had risen so many times that it seemed to echo against the quiet houses lining the street. His smirk lingered, his words sharp, but the boy had not flinched once. He stood in silence, headphones dangling from his hand, every insult rolling past him without cracking his composure. At last, he lifted his eyes, steady and unshaken, and met the officer's gaze directly. For a moment, the street seemed to pause, the bystanders leaning in as though waiting for something to break. His voice was calm, softer than the shouting that had filled the air, yet it cut through more sharply than any insult. "Are you sure you want to continue this?" he asked. The words were not spoken in anger. They carried no tremor of fear. They were deliberate, measured, as though the boy already knew something the officer did not. The officer blinked, surprised by the tone. He had expected pleading or defiance, anything that would justify his arrogance, but instead he found himself faced with a warning so subtle it unsettled him. For a heartbeat, silence held the street. The question hovered, sinking into the ears of those watching, and the crowd shifted uneasily. Some raised their phones higher, recording what they sensed was the turning point. The officer recovered quickly, forcing a laugh that rang hollow against the tension. He tilted his head back, shaking it as if the boy's words were ridiculous. "What are you going to do?" He sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. You think you can scare me with that tone? You don't get to warn me. I'm the one in charge here." His laughter followed, loud and artificial, as though he were trying to convince himself as much as the crowd. The boy did not move. His face remained calm, his eyes steady, his posture still dignified. The warning had been given, and he did not need to repeat it. The onlookers felt the weight of it, even if the officer refused to. The laugh that the officer forced only deepened the unease. Neighbors whispered quietly, the discomfort rippling outward, as though they all knew the balance was about to shift. The officer stepped closer, his smirk returning with force. He jabbed a finger in the boy's direction, his voice booming as though volume could erase the doubt that had crept in. "You think you're special? You think the world bends for you? Let me tell you something, kid. Nothing bends. You'll do what I say." His words rang out, but the conviction behind them wavered. Still, the boy did not answer. His calm silence stood as its own kind of authority, a presence stronger than the uniform before him. The officer's laughter echoed again, but it no longer carried the same strength. The crowd could sense it, and even he could feel it in the back of his mind. The warning had landed, and though he tried to dismiss it, the seed of doubt had been planted. Something was coming, and the smirk on his face would not be enough to protect him when it did. Engines still idled faintly from the police cruiser when the sound of heavier tires rolled into the street. The hum was deeper, steadier, not the buzzing patrol car, but something more deliberate. A sleek black SUV glided into view, slowing near the flashing lights. The bystanders' murmurs grew louder, phones lifting higher as they realized another scene was about to unfold. The SUV stopped at the curb with authority, and its tinted doors opened in practiced sequence. Two officials stepped out first, each in tailored suits, their badges clipped neatly to their belts. Their movements were sharp and certain, not like curious neighbors wandering into the spectacle, but like people who had arrived with purpose. Then came the figure who made the entire block fall silent. From the back seat emerged a man whose face many had seen on local news reports, his name tied to city decisions, policies, and speeches that shaped the community. He was no ordinary passerby. He was a high-ranking city leader, and his posture carried the weight of influence. His steps were quick and direct, eyes immediately locking on the teenager who stood still under the officer's sneer. The boy's expression softened for the first time. The calm resolve that had carried him through the barrage of mockery gave way to something warmer. The official's face lit with recognition, and in a voice strong enough for everyone to hear, he called the teenager by name. It was not just a casual acknowledgement, it was the voice of family, of kinship rooted deeper than titles. The bystanders who had been whispering moments earlier gasped audibly. The city leader crossed the distance swiftly, ignoring the officer who still hovered stiffly by his cruiser. He reached for the teen, pulling him into a firm embrace that radiated pride and protection. "I'm glad you're safe," he said, the words carrying easily over the stunned silence of the block. The boy hugged him back, his dignity intact but now bolstered by the visible presence of someone whose authority stretched far beyond the flashing lights. The officer's smirk faltered, his posture stiffening as the truth settled in. This was not just any teenager to belittle and mock. This was someone connected, someone whose family ties reached into the very heart of city power. His earlier arrogance seemed suddenly foolish, each insult echoing louder in the silence that followed the embrace. The onlookers whispered furiously, the story writing itself before their eyes. Phones captured every angle, how the official addressed the teen by name, how he embraced him like his own, how the officer stood pale and speechless in the background. The reversal was undeniable. For the boy, there was no need to speak further. His calm warning earlier had been enough, and now the truth stood beside him in flesh and blood. The embrace told the story better than words. The power the officer thought he had wielded had collapsed, and the dignity of the teen, strengthened by family and truth, had turned the moment into legend. The crowd had already shifted, the energy of the street no longer on the officer's side. Moments earlier he had strutted with arrogance, his voice loud, his smirk unshakable. Now, with the black SUV parked by the curb and the city leader's arm wrapped firmly around the teenager, the power he thought he owned drained from his face. His jaw tightened, his lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. The authority he had worn like armor cracked in an instant, leaving him exposed before neighbors, strangers, and recording phones. He stepped back slightly, his boots scraping the pavement, his eyes darting from the teenager to the official, then to the crowd. Each glance met with murmurs, whispers that carried disbelief and satisfaction. The same bystanders who had watched silently before now whispered openly, their phones lifted higher, their screens glowing as they documented every detail. The once commanding figure was reduced to a man cornered by his own arrogance, his posture collapsing under the weight of the truth. His hands fidgeted at his belt, a nervous tick where confidence once rested. The crowd could see it. They could see the sweat glistening on his temples, the way his shoulders slumped as if the air had been sucked out of him. He tried to force his smirk back onto his face, but it twisted awkwardly, no longer convincing. The badge on his chest, once a symbol of unquestioned authority, now looked fragile, flimsy against the silence of his shame. The official who had embraced the teenager spoke briefly to the officer, his words low but cutting, his expression stern. Whatever was said, it stripped away the last remnants of arrogance. The officer's eyes fell to the ground, avoiding the cameras, avoiding the gaze of the people he had mocked into silence only minutes earlier. His authority was gone. The uniform could not shield him from the truth revealed so clearly before everyone. Children who had peeked from behind their parents earlier now stepped forward, whispering to one another about the reversal they had just seen. Adults shook their heads, some with anger at the cruelty that had almost gone unchallenged, others with quiet satisfaction that justice had unfolded before their eyes. The boy who had stood calm through the insults was no longer the target of mockery. He was the center of respect, his dignity shining brighter because it had been tested and proven unbreakable. The officer stood stiff, his face pale, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. His voice, once loud enough to dominate the street, had vanished entirely. The crowd no longer listened to him. They were focused on the teen and the official, on the story that was already spreading. In that moment, the collapse was complete. Authority built on cruelty had crumbled, and the silence of a humbled man was all that remained. The story did not end on the street where it began. Within hours, videos captured by bystanders spread across phones, carried through text messages and social media posts. People replayed the scene again and again, hearing the insults, the sneers, the mocking tone of the officer, and then watching the quiet reversal unfold. They saw the teenager's composure, his calm question, his dignity intact even as he was belittled. They saw the black SUV, the official stepping out, the embrace that told everyone watching that this was no ordinary boy. The narrative shifted instantly, carried like wildfire beyond the neighborhood. In the days that followed, whispers in schools, workplaces, and community centers repeated the lesson. The teen's silence became a symbol of strength, proof that dignity has a power cruelty cannot erase. His name was spoken with admiration. People pointed out how he had not once raised his voice, not once lowered himself to match the officer's arrogance. Even in the face of humiliation, he had held steady, and it was that steadiness that magnified the collapse of the man who mocked him. The officer, on the other hand, became a cautionary tale. He was remembered not for the authority he tried to project, but for the arrogance that had crumbled so visibly before cameras and witnesses. His laughter, once loud and full of condescension, now echoed as the sound of his own downfall. Colleagues whispered about the shame of it, neighbors shook their heads, and strangers who had never met him repeated the story as an example of how pride can blind a person until it destroys them. The teenager walked through his community differently now, not because he sought attention, but because others looked at him with new eyes. Adults nodded to him with respect, children whispered about him with awe, and even those who had once ignored him now saw him as someone who had stood taller than insults. He did not boast. He did not seek recognition. His dignity remained the same quiet strength it had always been, but now the world had witnessed it. The lesson was clear, repeated in every retelling. Cruelty is loud but fragile. Dignity is quiet but unbreakable. The officer's uniform could not save him from humiliation because it had been built on arrogance, not respect. The teenager's calm presence carried further than anger ever could, and in the end, it was that presence that defined the story. Long after the lights faded and the SUV pulled away, the tale lived on, not just as gossip but as proof of a truth that resonated with everyone who heard it. Respect cannot be forced through mockery. Power cannot be sustained through arrogance. Dignity, held even in the hardest moments, outshines them all.